1995. IRM had a problem. Two recently obtained steam locomotives, one in Texas and the other in Iowa, were left with no engine to ferry them to their new home. Burlington Northern had a good relationship with the museum, but they had no locomotives to spare. Then, an idea came to mind. Emerging from Burlington Northern's Clyde shops in Cicero was IRM's latest diesel, newly repaired and ready for service. IRM's last hope was not of an engine known for its reliability, but an engine of a cult following, the titan of Wyoming's coalfields, and one of the last of its kind, former Burlington Northern General Electric U-30C, number 5383. General Electric is responsible for many successful American locomotives. The Dash 9s, the Evolution series, and the Genesis line are some of the most highly regarded locomotives in the modern day. But prior to these, General Electric was known for other designs. Prior to 1977, the stars of General Electric's locomotive catalog were the Universal series. Entering domestic production in 1961, the Universals, or U-boats as dubbed by crews, were the first crack in electromotive division's stronghold of the industry. While EMD was still the dominant locomotive builder by this time, GE posed a strong threat to their regime. The first American models, the U-25s, were a landmark achievement. 591 total were built, but sales were generally slow. This would not deter GE from pursuing its grand ambitions, however, regardless of the railroad's skepticism. Asking railroads for feedback, the next step up from the U-25s were the U-28s, offered in both 4-axle B and 6-axle C variants. These locomotives were designed to compete with the newly designed EMD GP40 and SD40, but struggled against the established builder. This wasn't a problem for GE, however, as the U-28 was intended to be a stopgap for a true successor to the U-25, the U-30. One of the greatest advantages of the GE locomotives were their adaptability of their prime movers, the 7FDL engine. From the onset, this engine was drawn up to be pushed far beyond the conservative power output of the U-25s. Locomotives with the same type of engine could produce far more horsepower and tractive effort than the competitors and railroads were anticipating. In fact, the 7FDL 16-cylinder model was used in North America from the U-25 in 1959 until the AC 4400CW was discontinued in 2004. That's a production run of 45 years for the same design of engine. The model name U-30C is derived from the series name, Universal Series, the horsepower output of 3,000 horsepower, and the CC wheel configuration, meaning the locomotive has 6 axles. While the U-30C's counterpart, the U-30B, was designed for moderate tonnage and fast merchandise freights, the U-30Cs excelled on slower, heavier trains. Although they used the same engine, the addition of more traction motors with the CC wheel arrangement meant that the U-30Cs were more adept on drag freights. The U-30C entered production in 1966, immediately after the last U-28Cs left the factory. In fact, the first 4 were even given U-28C class plates. And, appearance-wise, the early U-30Cs looked identical to the later U-28Cs. The differences were solely internal. Railroads began flocking to GE to purchase these units, as they were cheaper in price tag than the EMD SD40. Some railroads who rarely purchased GE engines, like the C&W or the Sioux Line, bit the bullet and ordered a good number of these engines. In total, 600 U-30Cs were produced from November 1966 to October 1976. The first of the Burlington Northern's U-30Cs were passed on from the Colorado and Southern. Painted in the CV&Q's Chinese vermilion, they were the only 4 U-30Cs to wear these colors in service. For over 2 years, these would be the only U-30Cs on the railroad's roster. However, thanks to a certain legislative development, this would not remain the case for long. By 1972, A new political environment would shape the railroad industry. With climate change being a global concern, the government's bipartisan Clean Air Act forced railroads like the Burlington Northern to find a cleaner, less sulfuric reservoir of coal. Thankfully, such a reservoir was discovered. In the remote corners of central Montana and northeastern Wyoming lay a region of rolling grasslands with an arid climate. Formerly the hunting grounds of the Oglala Lakota Nation, this area would later be known as the Powder River Basin. Millions of years ago, organic material in lakes and swamps accumulated in this basin and were formed into peat bogs. These bogs were compressed by overlying sediment shifted from the mountains and formed the coal mined today. This coal was classified as subbituminous and was less expensive to mine and cleaner to burn. As a result, dozens of coal mines opened up in the remote corner between Montana and Wyoming. To haul coal out of the mines, not only would new railroad lines need to be built, but a fleet of powerful, hardy locomotives had to be up to the challenge. Burlington Northern considered their options and placed an order with GE. They didn't order the higher horsepower U-33C, or even the more so U-36C, but rather the most versatile of them all, the U-30C. Immediately after delivery, these units were assigned to the coal trains of the Powder River Basin. They demonstrated a commendable balance of horsepower, tractive effort, lugging ability, and even fuel economy. In terms of performance, the U-30C was exactly what BN was looking for. During the 1970s and 1980s, U-30Cs could be seen across the BN system doing a variety of assignments. All were based out of Lincoln, later Alliance, Nebraska. However, a U-30C heading a hotshot freight out of Cicero's Clyde Yard wasn't uncommon. 5383 in particular could be seen working in southern Illinois around Beardstown, handling trains from the local coal mines on the former CB&Q line. However, it was in the Powder River Basin that the U-30Cs earned their keep. The rolling hills and vast flatlands were magnets for photographers. Working alongside BN's SD-40s, they were a welcome change from EMD power to railfans. However, they weren't always preferable to railroaders. The Universal Series, despite selling commercially well, did have their shortcomings. For starters, the engines were sometimes troublesome. Early GEs, including the U-30Cs, were known for slow loading and would have trouble getting a train moving. Wiring for many U-boats also consisted of aluminum, the brittle material causing electrical issues on many engines. The cabs were also relatively cramped compared to the EMD locomotives, and in one case, the doors could fall off. However, if you got them rolling, some railroaders would have to admit they were sufficient for the task. The GE 752 traction motors were held in high regard, perfect for lugging heavy trains the U-30Cs were designed for. The fuel economy was also relatively good, which along with the U-boat's low price tag made them a good financial investment for the railroads. But being worked hard in drag freight service took a toll on U-30Cs across the country. While lugging power was their forte, it was also their Achilles heel. The engines began to give out after years of heavy use. Starting around 1982, railroads began to part ways with the U-30Cs. The first railroads to retire them en masse were the Southern, the Chesapeake and Ohio, and the Sioux Line. By the end of the 1980s, most other Class I railroads followed suit. One of the holdouts was Burlington Northern. While many of the 1972-built locomotives had been retired or scrapped by 1990, the later batches held on. Not nearly as worn out as their older siblings, 5383 and the rest of the roster were kept on for at least a few more years. 5383 during this time would venture far and wide across the system. In the 1990s, IRM acquired a copy of the computerized report of 5383's final days in service. 5383 departed Inner Bay, Washington in the early hours of the 16th of April, 1994. It would go on to Wenatchee, Washington, leaving at 9 a.m. and arriving in Spokane 46 minutes past noon. By 8:26 p.m., it would leave eastbound on the Montana Rail Link under the cover of night. Upon its arrival at Laurel, Montana the next afternoon, 5383 was found to have a wheel set problem and was sidelined from service. It left Laurel later that afternoon, heading back to the Alliance Repair Facility. It arrived next morning on the 18th, and repairs were completed at 5 p.m. on April 23rd. However, the engine did not return to service, and was officially labeled as stored unserviceable pending retirement on June 7th, 1994. This is where the story should have ended for 5383. Many of its sisters would end up being sold or scrapped around this time, and it looked like the same fate would befall 5383. However, that timeline never played out. As documented in Rail and Wire issue 152, IRM's general manager, Nick Callas, inquired about the availability of a U-30C when conversing with Burlington Northern officials. The U-30C was specifically chosen, as it was the primary representative for GE's six-axle U-boats, and a part of the first generation of GE's modern locomotives. At the time, it was recognized that less than 24 were still in regular service in the U.S. Graciously, BN accepted IRM's request. On July 6th, 5383 was on its way, arriving at Aurora's Eola Yard on July 10th. From this point on, the locomotive's journey to the museum was not conventional. A month later, the locomotive was picked up by, of all trains, the Nebraska Zephyr. Returning from the Mendota Sweet Corn Festival on August 15th, 5383 was coupled onto the train at Eola, and the mismatched train headed to Chicago. After being interchanged onto the Chicago Northwestern, the train arrived at the museum at around 4 p.m. The locomotive's prime mover was fired up later that evening, but the engine still needed to be properly examined. After a team of volunteers went over the engine's condition on August 20th, the locomotive was found to have no major defects, but did have thin wheels and discharged batteries. On Members Weekend of 1994, the Illinois Railway Museum was given the papers transferring ownership of 5383 from BN. Wayne Hatton, former Vice President of Transportation for BN, and Jim Schwinkendorf, the BN Contact Administrator, were present during the handover. The locomotive thrilled crowds for the next 2 days, and included a team-up with BN SD24 number 6244, later to be known as Burlington 504, on a demonstration freight. Due to the wear of the wheels, 5383 was initially relegated to special events only, as replacement wheel sets were deemed counterproductive. But, surprisingly, this issue would be quickly rectified. In 1995, Burlington Northern was short on motive power, so they were in need of more locomotives, even after receiving new SD70 Max. So, they inquired about borrowing 5383 back from IRM to run revenue freights once more. IRM was hesitant, citing the thin wheels, but BN offered to replace said wheels at their Clyde shops in Cicero. The locomotive was sent to the repair facility via the CNW to West Chicago, and the BN to Cicero. The wheel sets were replaced and new batteries were installed, giving the engine the energy for its big tasks ahead. The locomotive was then sent to work, hauling trains west to Galesburg. But by September, the locomotive was ready for a truly historic moment. This is where the introductory story comes into play. Two steam locomotives, Burlington 3007 and TNNO number 975, needed to be moved to IRM's campus. 5383 first came to 3007's aid, picking up the Hudson at Des Moines, Iowa, and dropping it off in Galesburg. When it was scheduled south to pick up the other engine, 975, Burlington Northern staff allegedly rostered the engine to work north instead. IRM volunteer Bob McCutcheon had to intervene at least once so the locomotive didn't wander off. 5383 had to pick up the 975 in Beaumont, but BN did not reach the city. Instead, the U-boat was handed off to the Union Pacific, who happily put the U-30C on a train from Houston to Beaumont. An SP crew delivered the 975 to the UP yard, which then delivered the locomotive to the BN yard in Houston. With the BN crew in 5383 and IRM volunteers in 975, a long trek ahead awaited for them. The trip had several setbacks, as 975 had a tendency of its axle boxes running hot, and the crew having to get down and inspect the bearings. There were no proper seats in the steam engine's cab, and the tender would slam back into the engine at slow speeds. It was much preferable for the IRM volunteers to ride with the BN crew in 5383's cab. It was a rather difficult journey for the IRM and BN crews, probably the most tedious move in IRM's history. Nonetheless, 5383 persevered. It managed to make the over 1,000-mile trek to Galesburg after almost a month, all without fault. The consist was coupled onto 3007 at Galesburg, and the cavalcade arrived in Aurora. Backing down the branch from Aurora to West Chicago like the U-30C had done a year prior, the train arrived in Union at the end of October 1995. It was an engineering and operational feat for all involved, railroaders and museum volunteers alike, and 5383 helped to carry it out. Out of IRM's entire roster, none have directly saved other locomotives quite like 5383. It is an exemplification of IRM's unwavering persistence in railroad preservation. However, the story doesn't end here. After rescuing its new cohorts, 5383 had to be taken care of itself. The locomotive, while mechanically serviceable, was in need of a complete refurbishment. Photos from prior to 2005 show the locomotive with rusted door panels, especially on the engineer side. The locomotive had a failed intercooler, and it was inoperable for some time. As a result, a team of painters led by curator Jamie Kolanowski began plans to restore the U-boat. In March 2006, the locomotive had been sanded down, needle chipped, and wire brushed. By May, the locomotive had been masked and primed, ready for painting. June saw the locomotive regain its signature black top, and now it was onto one of the final steps, the green. Using a custom mixed Centauri paint formula, the body was repainted into a fresh Cascade green. In July, the locomotive made its first public appearance, being moved by SW1 number 15. The paint used for the locomotive has proved to be durable, as the coat you see on the engine now is the exact paint applied nearly 20 years ago. On the 11th of November, vinyl masking tape was removed, revealing underneath a crisp BN logo. The locomotive had yet to receive the numbers on the long hood. Those would be completed on the 23rd. Next year saw the engine posing for a number of daytime photographs, being moved around by other diesels. However, on April 21st, following a reinstallation of the intercooler, 5383 roared into life once more. The restoration is finally complete. Starting in May 2007, the locomotive began running regular museum trains once more. Arguably one of the best repaints IRM has done to date, the locomotive is regularly seen hauling the heavyweight trains in the absence of steam locomotives. On occasion, The engine even stands in for the Nebraska Zephyr, particularly during diesel days. Speaking of, diesel days are a prime opportunity for the U-30C to put on a show, often pulling demonstration freights with other diesels. In 2019, 5383 teamed up with U-28B number 260 on a heavyweight train. This was the first time two U-boats have operated together at the museum. On some occasions, 5383 was used for Take the Throttle events. As the name suggests, Take the Throttle events involve museum goers driving a locomotive under supervision for a fee. Despite the U-boat's checkered legacy, 5383 was used on Take the Throttle days as early as 2008. The program continues to this day, with 5383 often being available to drive through reservation during diesel days. 5383 has had a few mechanical issues even after its restoration, such as a failed reverser in 2010 and a faulty traction motor at one point, but it has continued to prove its worth. Often overshadowed by its EMD stablemates like the SD24 or the three GP7s, there is a certain charm to the green submarine. It can be said that there's nothing quite like 5383 at IRM, but that's also true to anywhere else. Despite the large number of U-30Cs built, very few survive. Those that do exist are on display, gutted, or unserviceable. The last U-30C in freight service, LS&I number 3009, was taken out of service in 2022. The fate of it and its two sisters on the LS&I is unclear. Therefore, BN 5383 is likely the only operational U-30C left. It's remarkable how a locomotive of questionable design has managed to persist into the modern day. The reputation of these U-boats, and their scarce numbers today, presents an idea that these engines are mere novelties, stepping stones for modern GE locomotives. However, in a personal opinion, 5383 serves as a pioneer to the famous locomotive builder. It was a noteworthy save by America's largest railroad museum. Managing to save two steam locomotives from an uncertain fate, it defined the narrative of the troublesome U-boat. Its reward, after years of neglect and wear, is to be a shining example of IRM's restoration work. A legendary locomotive from General Electric.